Welcome to Velvet Shadows. Before we begin, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. We post new stories every week. And drop a comment below, letting us know what city you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Now, let's get into the story. The morning Caleb Harrington asked his wife to sign the papers, he was wearing the new cologne she had never smelled on him before their marriage. She noticed everything. She had trained herself to notice. The way a person who lives near a fault line learns to feel the smallest tremor before anyone else does. Elena Harrington stood at the kitchen counter with her coffee and said nothing. She had been saying nothing for a long time. Their house in Greenwich, Connecticut was the kind of house that appeared in architectural magazines. 12-foot ceilings, a garden that someone else maintained, a kitchen with appliances Elena had never once used because Caleb hired a cook 3 years into their marriage and told her it was a gift. She had understood even then that it was not a gift, it was a message. You are decorative here. You are a fixture. You do not need to produce anything useful because what you produce has never interested me. The papers were for a pharmaceutical licensing deal. His company, Harrington Biomedical, acquiring a smaller firm out of Austin called Meridian Health Technologies. Caleb needed her signature because 3 years prior, during a period when his company was hemorrhaging cash and 2 of his major investors had walked, Elena had quietly restructured a portion of their shared assets to prevent the bank from calling in a personal agent anymore. She had done it without making a scene, without asking for credit, and without telling him the full extent of what she had moved or why. The lawyers had presented it to him as a routine protective measure. He had signed where they told him to sign and gone back to his dinner. Now her name was on the collateral. She set down her coffee and looked at the documents he had slid across the island toward her. "You need this by when?" she asked. "End of week," Caleb said. He was already looking at his phone. She picked up the pen, then she put it back down. "I want to read them first," she said. He looked up then. Not because her request was unreasonable. It was completely reasonable. But because in 7 years of marriage, Elena Harrington had not once asked to read a document before signing it. She had trusted him, or she had appeared to trust him, which was not the same thing at all. "It's standard," he said. "Legal already reviewed it." "I'm sure they did," she said. "I'd still like to read it." She took the papers upstairs. She did not come back down. Elena Harrington was 38 years old, and she had a master's degree in biochemistry from Johns Hopkins that Caleb had mentioned exactly once at a dinner party, in passing, as a throwaway detail before pivoting to talk about his own undergraduate years at Duke. She had stopped correcting the impression he gave people, that she was a pleasant woman of comfortable background who had married well, and stopped there. It was easier. And she had reasons for a long time to let him believe what he wanted to believe. Her father, Dr. Raymond Whitfield, had died when she was 34. He had been a quiet man, a research scientist, who spent 40 years working in pharmaceutical compound development and published papers that almost no one outside his specific field had ever read. He had never been wealthy in the way Caleb was wealthy, the kind of wealth that announces itself in square footage and watch brands, and the casual mention of properties in other time zones. Raymond Whitfield had been wealthy in the older, quieter way. Patents. A portfolio of compound patents that had been licensing quietly to 3 major pharmaceutical manufacturers for the better part of 2 decades, generating royalty income that he had never mentioned to his son-in-law and that Elena had continued to receive and reinvest and say nothing about. The vault in the Whitfield family home in Annapolis contained the original research notebooks. Her father's handwriting. 40 years of it. The formulations, the trials, the corrections, the small triumphant notations in the margins where something had finally worked. She had read them all. She understood them. She had in fact spent the first 2 years of her marriage continuing his research in a private lab she leased under a shell company her father's attorney had established before he died. Caleb did not know about the lab. Caleb did not know about the patents. Caleb did not know that his wife, whom he had introduced at his firm's anniversary gala as my Elena, she used to be in science before we got married, had filed 4 independent patents in her own name in the 30 months following her father's death. She had not hidden these things out of strategy, not at first. She had hidden them out of grief and out of a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being loved only as much as you are useful to someone who does not actually see you. You stop offering the most valuable parts of yourself because the offering always gets lost somewhere between your hand and theirs, and after a while it simply hurts less to keep it. But grief changes. It clarifies. By the time Caleb slid those papers across the kitchen island, Elena had been ready to leave for just over a year. She had been waiting for one specific thing, and it had almost arrived. The thing arrived on a Wednesday. Elena had an appointment with her attorney, Margaret Osey, at 11 in the morning. She drove herself, in the blue Volvo she had bought with her own money, and that Caleb had never once commented on, which told her everything she needed to know about how much attention he paid to her life. She parked in the garage off Post Road and walked the 2 blocks to Margaret's office and sat down in a chair across from a woman who had been managing the Whitfield estate's legal affairs for 9 years. "The FDA approval came through this morning," Margaret said, sliding a folder across the desk. Elena opened it. "Read the first page. Read it again. The compound, a modified anti-inflammatory formulation her father had been developing for late-stage osteoarthritis, which Elena had completed and refined and brought through clinical trial in collaboration with a small research hospital in Philadelphia, had received full approval. First in class. Nothing comparable existed on the market. She closed the folder. "Meridian Health Technologies," she said. Margaret nodded slowly. "They reached out to our licensing arm 6 weeks ago. I didn't tell you, because I wanted to see how serious they were first. And they're very serious. But there's something you should know." Margaret folded her hands on the desk. "Meridian is currently in acquisition talks." Elena already knew. She had read Caleb's papers. "Harrington Biomedical," she said. Yes, there was a silence in the room that had a particular texture to it. Not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but precise. Like the moment before a diagnosis is spoken aloud. "How long has Meridian known about the patent?" Elena asked. "The licensing inquiry was initiated by someone at Meridian who found the compound through the clinical trial publication," Margaret said. "My understanding is that Harrington Biomedical's acquisition team became aware of the patent during their due diligence on Meridian. Approximately 3 weeks ago." Elena set her hands flat on the desk. "Caleb knows. He would have been briefed. Yes." She thought about the kitchen, the cologne she didn't recognize, the way he had not looked at her when he slid the papers across the island, and the way he had looked at her when she picked up the pen and then set it back down. Not irritation. Something more careful than irritation. He knew exactly whose name was on that patent. He had known when he asked her to sign. He had been hoping she would do what she had always done, sign without reading, trust without asking, smooth the path under his feet, and ask nothing in return. She drove home. She did not call him. She went upstairs, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop and looked at the timeline she had been building in a private document for 14 months, every date, every decision, everything she had been waiting to be ready for. She was ready. Caleb came home at 7:15 that evening with a bottle of wine and a restaurant bag from the Italian place in Westport that she had mentioned once, maybe 2 years ago, was her favorite. She watched him come through the door with it. She watched him look for her. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the licensing folder from Margaret's office open in front of her. He stopped in the doorway. The bottle of wine stayed in his hand. "Elena," he said. "I read the papers," she said. He set the restaurant bag on the counter. Slowly, the way a person moves when they are calculating the distance to the nearest exit. "I thought we could have dinner and talk through the details. The compound is mine, Caleb." Her voice was completely level. This was not the voice of a woman who had just found out. This was the voice of a woman who had known for 14 months and had spent that time deciding exactly how this conversation would go. "The patents are mine. Meridian's primary asset, the reason your firm wants them, is a formulation that I developed, that I funded, and that my father spent the last decade of his life laying the groundwork for. You knew that when you handed me those documents." He put the wine down. I didn't know the full extent. You were briefed 3 weeks ago. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was not rage and was not tears. It was the expression of a person who has walked to the edge of something and looked down and no longer feels afraid of the height. I need you to understand something. I am not angry. I am not going to make a scene. I am going to tell you exactly what is going to happen, and I would like you to listen. Caleb Harrington was 43 years old. He ran a company with 400 employees and a market cap just under $2 billion. He had sat across from hostile board members and aggressive investors and journalists who wanted his blood. He had never, in 7 years of marriage, had a conversation with his wife that made the back of his neck go cold. I want a divorce, Elena said. My attorney has already filed. You'll receive the paperwork tomorrow morning. The asset division is straightforward. I'm not pursuing the marital estate beyond what is legally mine. I have no interest in your company, your properties, or your accounts. What I am keeping is my own. Elena. The acquisition, she said, is not going to proceed the way your team has structured it. You cannot acquire the compound without my licensing consent, which I will not be giving to Harrington Biomedical. She closed the folder. I have a standing offer from a hospital system in Chicago that has been interested in the compound for 18 months. It does not involve you in any capacity. Caleb stared at her. The restaurant bags sat on the counter between them, getting cold. You've been planning this, he said. I've been waiting for the right time, she said. This is the right time. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. For a long moment, he said nothing. She watched him go through the stages. The calculation, the pivot toward negotiation, the assessment of leverage. She had watched him do this in business meetings. She knew exactly what it looked like. I need that compound, he said finally. You know what it would mean for the Meridian deal alone. I know what it would mean, she said. I am the one who built it. We could structure something, he said. A separate licensing entity. You retain rights. Caleb. She said his name quietly, and he stopped. There is no version of this where I give you access to my father's work. Not because I am punishing you, because you have had 7 years to understand what I am capable of, and you chose, every single day of those 7 years, not to look. I can't give that work to someone who doesn't see it. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one in Margaret's office. It was the silence of something ending, not dramatically, not with wreckage, but with finality. The way a door closes in a house that is going to be sold. She stood up. I've already arranged for my things to be moved. I'll be gone by the weekend. She picked up the folder. The food is probably still warm. You should eat. She walked out of the kitchen. She stayed in a hotel in New Haven for the first 2 weeks, not because she couldn't afford better, but because the anonymity felt right. A neutral room. No objects with histories. She worked at a small desk by the window every morning, corresponding with the Chicago Spills development team, responding to the inquiries that had begun arriving from pharmaceutical publications following the FDA announcement, and speaking at length with Margaret, who was handling the divorce proceedings with the quiet efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this outcome for several years. The compound was designated for licensing under a new entity, Whitfield Scientific, LLC. The name had been her father's suggestion in a letter he had left with his will, and that Margaret had held for 4 years until Elena told her the time had come. You will know when, the letter said. You always know. I have always known that about you, even when you didn't. She read the letter 3 times in the hotel room in New Haven and cried in the way she hadn't let herself cry for a very long time. Then she washed her face and went back to work. The news moved through the pharmaceutical industry the way news moves through any industry where money and science intersect quickly, and with the particular energy of people who recognize a shift before they can fully name it. Whitfield Scientific's compound was the first of its kind. The clinical data was unambiguous. The FDA approval was not provisional. There was no asterisk. The Chicago Hospital System partnership was structured so that Whitfield retained full patent ownership with a licensing model that Margaret had spent 6 weeks negotiating, one that included profit-sharing provisions, a research continuation fund, and a clause ensuring that Elena remained involved in the compound's clinical application and development. It was the last provision that had surprised the Chicago team's lawyers, initially. Most patent holders in her position would have taken the money and walked. Why does she want continued involvement? One of the attorneys had asked Margaret. Because she's a scientist, Margaret had said. She's not selling a product. She's continuing her father's work. There was a pause on the line. That's not the answer I expected, the attorney said. I know, Margaret said. Caleb called once. It was 6 weeks after the night in the kitchen, a Saturday afternoon when Elena was sitting in the garden of the small house she had rented in Guilford, Connecticut. A quiet town on the Sound, with a harbor you could see from the backyard, and a silence that didn't feel like absence. It felt like space. She looked at his name on her phone for a long moment. She answered. I've been thinking about what you said, he told her. Not about the business. The part about looking, about not choosing to look. She waited. I think you're right, he said. I don't have any defense for it. I think I knew somewhere that you were more than I was letting you be, and I think I found that. He stopped. I think it was easier for me if you were smaller. She had not expected that. She had expected negotiation or anger or a pivot to practicalities. She had not expected honesty. I know, she said. That's not an apology, he said. I know it isn't enough to be one. No, she said, it isn't. Another silence. Outside, a bird she hadn't identified yet landed on the garden fence and regarded her with the supreme indifference of a creature that has no use for human drama. Are you okay? Caleb asked. It was, she thought, the first time he had asked her that in years. Maybe longer? Yes, she said, and meant it in a way she couldn't have 6 months ago. Good, he said. That's good. She ended the call. Sat for a while, with the phone in her lap, and the sound visible through the garden gate, the water moving in that slow, reliable way it had been moving long before either of them existed, and would continue moving long after neither of them did. She was not glad that the marriage had happened. She was not glad it had ended the way it had. But she was glad, and the gladness was solid, not fragile, the kind that doesn't require anything from anyone else to sustain itself, that she had not become someone who stayed. She had been her father's daughter her whole life. Quiet, methodical, patient, in the way that real patience is. Not passive, but purposeful. Waiting not because she didn't know what she wanted, but because she understood the value of the right moment. The right moment had come. She had been ready for it, that, she thought, was the whole story. Not the compound, not the divorce, not the deal with Chicago, not even the look on Caleb's face, when he finally understood what she had built while he wasn't paying attention. The story was that she had known who she was the entire time. She had simply been waiting to say it out loud. The Whitfield Scientific Research Center opened 14 months later in a converted building near the Johns Hopkins Medical Campus in Baltimore, not far from where Elena had spent 3 years earning the degree that her former husband had mentioned once at a party, in passing, before moving on to something more interesting. The opening was small. No press event, no gala, no architect's photography. A handful of researchers who had worked on the compound through its clinical trial phase. Margaret, who brought flowers and champagne, and cried in the parking lot afterward, and denied it. A few colleagues from the Philadelphia hospital. The director of the Chicago partnership, who shook Elena's hand and said, "Simply, your father would have been proud and was right." On the wall of the main lab, in a small frame, was a photograph of Raymond Whitfield at his desk in the Annapolis house. He was maybe 50 in the photo. Younger than Elena was now, bent over a notebook, pen in hand, wholly absorbed, oblivious to the camera, somewhere in the middle of figuring something out. Underneath the photograph, Elena had written 4 words on a small card. "We finish what matters." She looked at it for a moment on the day the building opened, with the noise of people behind her, and the autumn light coming through the windows and the low, specific satisfaction of a person who has arrived somewhere they chose to arrive. Then, she turned back to her team, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. We'd love to know what part stayed with you. And if you're new to Velvet Shadows, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.